The magnificent chestnut stallion stood proudly in the sunlight, his coat gleaming with health and vitality as a young girl braided wildflowers into his mane. Nobody would have guessed that just 3 years earlier, this same horse had been abandoned at an auction lot, ribs showing through his dull coat, head hanging low with defeat. The rich businessman who had discarded him like trash drove past in his luxury car, jaw-dropping at the sight of the animal he once considered worthless. He pulled over, unable to believe his eyes. The horse recognized him immediately, turning away to nuzzle the girl who had saved his life, choosing love over the man who had seen him as nothing but a burden. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Harrison Montgomery III adjusted his designer tie as he strode through the immaculately maintained stables of his country estate. At 58, he had built an empire in commercial real estate, with properties scattered across 3 continents and a net worth that had long ago crossed into the billions. Everything in his life was measured by its value and return on investment, including the animals that populated his sprawling property. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the cobblestone flooring as he made his way to the last stall, where an aging chestnut stallion named Traveler stood quietly. The horse had been a 40th birthday present to himself, a gorgeous Arabian with bloodlines that could be traced back generations and a price tag that had made even Harrison pause momentarily. For years, Traveler had been the crown jewel of his collection, a status symbol Harrison proudly displayed during polo matches and to impressed business associates. Mr. Montgomery, his stable manager Patrick, greeted him with a deferential nod. "I've prepared the paperwork for tomorrow's auction as requested." Harrison barely acknowledged the greeting, his cold gray eyes fixed on the horse. Once magnificent, Traveler now showed his 18 years. His muzzle had grayed, and while he was still handsome, he lacked the fire that had once made him extraordinary. "Good. Make sure they understand his bloodline," Harrison said, not bothering to reach out and touch the animal who had been in his possession for nearly 2 decades. Someone might still pay decently for breeding rights, though I doubt it at his age. Patrick shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if I might suggest, Traveler could still have many good years as a companion horse. He's gentle, well-trained. Perhaps retirement here would be—" "Retirement?" Harrison scoffed, cutting him off. "Do I look like I run a charity for worn-out livestock? This stall could house something worth the feed bill." Traveler's ears flicked toward the familiar voices, his large, liquid eyes watching Harrison with what almost seemed like understanding. The horse took a step forward and extended his muzzle toward his owner. Harrison stepped back reflexively. "Keep him presentable for tomorrow. I want him groomed impeccably, though I doubt it'll help much. The market for older horses is practically non-existent." He checked his platinum watch. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in 30 minutes. Email me if there are any issues with the auction paperwork." As Harrison walked away, Patrick reached out to stroke Traveler's neck apologetically. "I'm sorry, old boy," he murmured once his employer was out of earshot. "I tried." The horse snickered softly, leaning into Patrick's touch. For years, it had been the stable manager who had exercised Traveler, who had treated his occasional lameness, who had slipped him apple slices and talked to him on quiet evenings when Harrison was away on business, which was most of the time. Patrick was the only human the horse truly knew, and tomorrow, even that small comfort would be gone. Patrick pulled a slightly bruised apple from his pocket, one he'd saved from his lunch. "Here you go, one last treat from me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could buy you myself, but on my salary." He didn't finish the thought. They both knew what tomorrow would bring. As night fell over Montgomery Estate, Traveler stood quietly in his stall, unaware that this would be his last night in the place he'd called home for most of his life. In the main house, Harrison reviewed quarterly reports and made calls to investors, not giving the horse another thought. In his world, everything and everyone was replaceable, and sentiment was an unaffordable luxury. The auction lot was crowded with potential buyers the next morning, though most had come for the younger, more promising stock. Harrison had arranged for Traveler to be transported there separately from his other horses. The animal was now simply inventory to be liquidated, not worth his personal attention. He had more important matters to attend to: a potential development deal, that could add millions to his already substantial fortune. Patrick had come along to handle the details, his heart heavy as he led Traveler from the transport trailer. The horse was impeccably groomed, his chestnut coat gleaming in the morning sun, black mane and tail freshly trimmed. To an untrained eye, he still looked impressive, but the serious buyers could see the slight dip in his back, the cautious way he moved, betraying his age. The auctioneer's rapid-fire speech filled the air as horses were paraded before the crowd, prices called out, and hammers falling to seal their fates. When Traveler's turn came, Patrick led him proudly into the ring, standing tall beside the animal who had been in his care for so long. Next up, lot number 47, purebred Arabian stallion, 18 years old, excellent bloodlines, proven stud, trained in dressage and jumping. Starting bid at $5,000. The auctioneer announced, his voice lacking enthusiasm. Everyone knew that older horses, regardless of their prestigious backgrounds, rarely commanded high prices. Patrick looked out at the crowd, hoping against hope to see someone who might recognize Traveler's worth beyond his commercial value, someone who might provide him a comfortable retirement. But the audience was largely silent. A few whispers exchanged, but no hands raised. 5,000? Do I hear 5,000? The auctioneer repeated, voice sharpening with impatience. All right, let's start lower. 3,000? The silence grew uncomfortable. A few potential buyers looked at their catalogs, flipping to other lots. Others scrolled through their phones, already moving on. 2,000? Surely this fine animal is worth 2,000? A hand finally went up at the back of the crowd. Patrick's heart leapt, then sank just as quickly when he recognized the Bidera-known kill buyer who purchased horses for slaughterhouses across the border. The thought of Traveler ending up there was unbearable. We have 2,000. Do I hear 2,500? The auctioneer looked around desperately, but no further bids were forthcoming. Going once for 2,000? 2,500? Patrick called out suddenly, raising his own hand. He didn't have that kind of money. Not really. But he couldn't bear the alternative. The kill buyer looked annoyed, but raised his hand again. 3,000. Patrick swallowed hard. His yearly bonus wouldn't come for months, and his savings were meager. 3,500, he said, voice cracking slightly. 4,000, came the immediate response from the back. The auctioneer looked between them, clearly pleased that the otherwise dead lot was generating some interest. 4,000 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 4,500? Patrick stood frozen, the reality of his situation hitting him. He couldn't compete. Not really. His hand remained at his side, though it physically hurt him not to raise it. 4,000 going once, going twice? No sale, came a sharp voice from the entrance to the auction ring. Harrison Montgomery stood there, elegant in a tailored suit despite the dusty surroundings. Remove this lot from the auction. The crowd murmured in surprise, and the auctioneer looked confused. Sir, we have a valid bid of $4,000, and the horse is worth 10 times that, even in his current state, Harrison snapped, though everyone present knew this was far from true. There's been a mistake. This animal isn't for sale today. The kill buyer shrugged and made a notation in his catalog, already focusing on the next potential purchase. Patrick led Traveler from the ring, confusion and relief warring in his expression. Harrison met them outside the auction area, his face an unreadable mask. What were you thinking? He asked Patrick coldly. Sir, I couldn't let him go to slaughter, Patrick began. And I can't have a Montgomery horse sold for a pittance to end up as dog food, Harrison countered. It reflects poorly on the bloodstock I sell. Tie him to the trailer and stay with him. I need to make some calls. For hours, Traveler stood patiently beside the trailer, occasionally pawing at the ground or swishing his tail at flies. Patrick remained with him, offering water and quiet reassurance, though he himself had no idea what would happen next. Inside the auction house, Harrison made numerous phone calls, attempting to arrange a private sale to someone who might pay a price he deemed more appropriate for an animal with Traveler's pedigree. As the day wore on, the heat increased, and the auction began to wind down. Buyers departed with their new purchases, trailers pulling away one by one. Patrick watched the shadows lengthen, growing increasingly concerned. Finally, Harrison emerged, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket. His expression was thunderous. "No takers?" Patrick ventured carefully. "Not at any reasonable price," Harrison replied, voice clipped with irritation. "Everyone wants young stock these days. No one appreciates the value of experienced bloodlines." Patrick hesitated. "Sir, what should I do with Traveler now? The transport back to the estate is leaving soon." Harrison looked at the horse with clear disdain, as if the animal had deliberately decreased in value to inconvenience him. "I'm not paying to transport damaged goods back to my property. The cost isn't justified." "But, sir," Patrick began, alarm rising in his chest. "I've made arrangements with the auction house," Harrison interrupted, checking his watch impatiently. "They'll keep him here until I find a private buyer, or until next month's auction. Their fee is less than transporting him back and forth." "He'll be alone in a strange place," Patrick protested. "He's never been stabled anywhere but our estate since you purchased him." Harrison's expression hardened. "He's a horse, Patrick, not a child. He doesn't have feelings to consider. If you're so concerned, you're welcome to visit him on your own time." He straightened his tie. "Now, I need to get back. The Peterson deal is closing tomorrow, and I have preparations to make." Patrick watched helplessly as Harrison strode toward his waiting luxury sedan. "What should I tell the stable hands about Traveler?" he called after him. Harrison didn't even turn around. "Tell them whatever you want. It makes no difference to me." As the sleek black car pulled away, Patrick turned to Traveler, who stood watching him with those large, trusting eyes. "I'll come back for you," he promised, though he had no idea how he could possibly keep that promise. "I won't leave you here forever." But promises, however well-intentioned, sometimes prove impossible to keep. Patrick did return, every few days at first, bringing carrots and apples, making sure Traveler was receiving adequate care from the auction staff. The horse would whinny with recognition when he approached, pressing his muzzle into Patrick's chest in greeting. Each time, Patrick left with a heavier heart, knowing he was only prolonging their goodbye. Harrison, meanwhile, made a few half-hearted attempts to sell Traveler privately, but his asking price remained unrealistic for a horse of that age. As weeks passed, he stopped inquiring about the animal altogether, consumed by new acquisitions and business ventures. When the auction house called about the mounting boarding fees, he instructed his assistant to handle it, effectively washing his hands of the whole matter. The auction house staff were not cruel, but they were busy with a constant rotation of livestock. Traveler received basic care but little attention. His coat lost its shine, and he grew increasingly withdrawn, no longer nickering at the approach of humans or showing interest in the activities around him. He was just another animal awaiting sale, one among dozens. When a month had turned into 2, Patrick's visits became less frequent, constrained by work obligations and family commitments. The auction house was an hour's drive from his home, and the cost of gas alone was becoming difficult to justify on his salary. His last visit was brief, a hurried stop between errands, but Traveler still recognized him, still pressed against him in quiet desperation. Patrick left with tears in his eyes, hating himself for his helplessness. 3 months after the failed auction, a sudden autumn storm swept through the region. Rain pounded against the auction house roofs, and wind rattled the temporary stabling where Traveler was kept. In the chaos of securing loose equipment and ensuring the safety of the more valuable stock, no one noticed when the aging latch on Traveler's pen gave way under the force of a particularly strong gust. For the first time in months, Traveler found himself unconfined. He stepped cautiously into the rain-slicked aisle between stalls, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of freedom carried on the wind. With no one to stop him, he made his way toward the partially open door at the end of the row, pushed wider by the same wind that had freed him. Outside, the store raged, but Traveler had weathered worse in his younger days, when Harrison had occasionally permitted him to remain in the pasture overnight. The rain plastered his mane to his neck as he walked with increasing confidence away from the buildings, through the empty parking area, and toward the open gate that led to the road beyond. By the time the auction staff realized he was missing, Traveler had already disappeared into the stormy night, a ghost of the once proud stallion, seeking something even he couldn't define perhaps, simply an end to the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Miles from the auction house, on a small farm that had seen better days, the Martinez family huddled together in their modest living room. The storm had knocked out the power, and they sat by the light of battery-operated lanterns, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof of their old farmhouse. Miguel Martinez, a weathered man in his late 40s, looked up from the bills spread across the coffee table, concern etching lines into his forehead. The east fence near the road was starting to lean yesterday. I should check if this wind has taken it down completely. His wife, Elena, glanced worriedly toward the window, where rain streamed down in sheets. Can't it wait until morning? You'll be soaked through. If it's down now, the chickens can wander onto the road by sunrise, Miguel said, already reaching for his heavy work jacket. It won't take long. Their 16-year-old daughter, Lucia, looked up from the math homework she'd been struggling to complete by lantern light. I'll come with you, Papa. 2 will be faster than 1. Miguel started to protest, but Lucia was already pulling on her rubber boots. She had always been stubborn, just like her mother, and he knew that particular determined set of her jaw all too well. Bring the big flashlight, he conceded with a small smile. The one in the drawer by the sink. Together, they ventured into the storm, heads bent against the driving rain as they made their way along the muddy path toward the road. Lucia directed the beam of the flashlight ahead of them, the yellow glow barely penetrating the curtain of water that surrounded them. When they reached the fence line, Miguel's fears were confirmed. A large section had indeed collapsed, leaving a gap wide enough for their few livestock to escape if they wandered this far from the barn. We'll need to put up a temporary barrier until I can fix it properly, Miguel shouted over the howling wind. Run back to the shed and bring the roll of wire and the cutters. Lucia nodded and turned to go, but before she could take a step, the flashlight beam caught something moving on the road beyond the fallen fence. She froze, tightening her grip on the light. Papa, look! Miguel squinted through the rain. At first, all he could see was the sheen of water on asphalt, but then a shape emerged from the darkness, a large animal, moving slowly along the deserted country road. Is that a horse? Lucia whispered, though there was no need to lower her voice in the roar of the storm. It was indeed a horse, and as it drew nearer, they could see it was in poor condition. Even through the rain, its ribs were visible, its head hung low, and it moved with the careful steps of an animal conserving what little energy it had left. It must have escaped from somewhere in the storm, Miguel said, already moving toward the gap in the fence. We can't leave it out here. It could be hit by a car or collapse from exhaustion. Lucia followed close behind, directing the flashlight to guide their steps. The horse stopped when the light beam fell on it, raising its head slightly, ears flicking forward with what might have been curiosity or wariness. Easy now, Miguel called, his voice gentle despite having to project it over the storm. We're not going to hurt you. He approached slowly, one hand extended palm up, the way he'd seen horse trainers do on the educational programs Lucia liked to watch. The horse didn't flee, but neither did it come closer, regarding them with wary eyes that reflected the flashlight's beam. Miguel stopped a few feet away, not wanting to spook the animal. Rain ran down his face and soaked through his jacket, but he hardly noticed. Do you think it belongs to the Hendersons? He asked Lucia, referring to a family a few miles down the road who kept several horses. Lucia shook her head. Their horses are all paints. This one's different looks, like maybe an Arabian or something fancy. She took a careful step closer. He's beautiful, even like this. As if understanding her words, the horse lifted his head a little higher, a ghost of pride visible in his posture despite his poor condition. He took a tentative step toward Lucia, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. He likes you, Miguel observed with a small smile. See if he'll let you touch him while I check for identification. Lucia extended her hand the way her father had, speaking in a soft, continuous murmur that was more about the soothing tone than the words themselves. It's okay, boy. You're safe now. We'll get you out of this storm. To their surprise, the horse stepped forward and pressed his muzzle against her palm, a gesture of tentative trust that made Lucia's breath catch. Oh, Papa, He's so thin and cold. Miguel carefully examined the horse, looking for any tags, brands, or other identification. There was nothing obvious, though the animal was clearly domesticated and had once been well cared for. Let's get him to the barn, he decided. We can figure out who he belongs to tomorrow, after the storm passes. Together, they coaxed the horse through the gap in the fence and up the muddy path toward their small barn. It was nothing like the state-of-the-art stables Traveler had known at Montgomery Estate, but it was dry and warm, with the comforting smells of hay and the soft sounds of the Martinez family's 2 milk cows. Elena met them at the barn door, eyes widening at the sight of the bedraggled horse. Dios mío! Where did he come from? Found him on the road, Miguel explained, leading the horse into an empty stall they normally used for storage. No identification that I could see. Elena was already grabbing towels from a shelf, her practical nature taking over. He's half-starved. Lucia, get some of the oats we feed the chickens. And warm water, not cold. We don't want to shock his system. As they worked to dry and feed the exhausted animal, a strange feeling of rightness settled over the family. They had little to spare, especially with Miguel's hours at the factory recently cut back, but the thought of turning away an animal in need never crossed their minds. Traveler, for his part, seemed to understand he had found sanctuary. He accepted their care with quiet dignity, eating the modest offering of oats with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything in months. When Lucia stroked his neck and whispered promises of better days ahead, he leaned into her touch, finding comfort in the presence of humans who asked nothing of him but to simply exist. That night, while the storm continued to rage outside, Traveler slept deeply for the first time since leaving Montgomery Estate. In the stall next to him, Lucia had spread out an old sleeping bag, insisting on staying to make sure their new guest remained calm through the night. As she drifted off to the sound of gentle breathing from the stall beside her, she couldn't know that the arrival of this mysterious horse would change all their lives in ways none of them could imagine. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, painting strips of gold across the half-strewn floor. Lucia woke to the familiar sounds of the cows stirring in their stalls and the chickens clucking impatiently for their breakfast. For a moment, she lay still, momentarily confused by her surroundings. Then memory rushed back: the storm, the fallen fence, the horse. She sat up quickly, turning toward the neighboring stall. Traveler stood quietly watching her, head extended over the low partition between the stalls. In the clear morning light, his condition was even more apparent than it had been in the darkness of the storm. His coat, once gleaming, was dull and patchy in places. Ribs and hip bones pressed against his skin, and his eyes, though alert, held a wariness that spoke of recent mistreatment or neglect. Despite all this, there was something undeniably noble about him. The way he held his head, the fine lines of his face, the intelligent gaze that seemed to be assessing Lucia just as carefully as she was assessing him. "Good morning, handsome," she said softly, rising to her feet. She approached him slowly, hand extended as it had been the night before. "Did you sleep well?" Traveler nickered softly, a sound that seemed to express both greeting and affirmation. He lowered his head to allow her to stroke his forelock, an unexpected gesture of trust that brought a lump to Lucia's throat. The barn door creaked open, and Elena entered, carrying a bucket of water in one hand and a small bundle under her arm. "Ah, you're awake. How is our guest this morning?" "Better, I think," Lucia replied, not taking her eyes off the horse. "He seems more alert." Elena set down the water bucket and unwrapped the bundle, revealing a couple of slightly bruised apples and a handful of baby carrots. "These were in the back of the refrigerator. Not perfect, but they'll do until we can get proper horse feed." Lucia took one of the apples and offered it to Traveler on her flat palm, the way she'd seen in movies. The horse's velvety lips tickled her skin as he delicately accepted the treat, crunching it with obvious enjoyment. "Papa called Dr. Rivera," Elena said, watching the interaction with a soft smile. "He's not a horse vet, but he said he'd come by this afternoon to take a look. Also, your father put up signs at the feed store and the gas station about finding a horse. If anyone's looking for him, they'll know where to press. Find him. A small frown creased Lucia's brow. What if his owners were the ones who let him get like this? Do we have to give him back? Elena sighed, understanding her daughter's concern. Let's not worry about that yet. First, we make sure he's healthy. Then, we'll figure out the rest. Throughout the day, travelers seemed to grow stronger. Miguel reinforced the stall to make it more suitable for a horse, while Lucia spent every moment she could with their new guest, brushing his coat with an old hairbrush, the best they could manage until they could afford proper grooming tools and talking to him about everything and nothing. You know, she told him as she worked a tangle from his mane, I've always wanted a horse. Papa used to promise that when his invention took off, he'd buy me one. She smiled at the memory. He's always tinkering with things in the shed. Says one day he'll create something that changes everything. Mama says he's a dreamer, but I think that's a good thing. Traveler listened with the patient attention of one accustomed to human chatter, occasionally nickering softly as if encouraging her to continue. I should give you a name, Lucia mused, stepping back to admire her handiwork on his mane. I can't just keep calling you horse or boy. Traveler lifted his head at this, meeting her eyes with an intensity that startled her. Unless you already have a name? Lucia felt slightly foolish talking to him, as if he could understand every word, but something about this horse made it seem entirely natural. I wish you could tell me what it is. When Dr. Rivera arrived that afternoon, he confirmed what they already suspected: the horse was undernourished and showing signs of neglect, but otherwise appeared to be in reasonably good health for his age, which the doctor estimated to be around 18 to 20 years. He's an Arabian, purebred from the look of him, Dr. Rivera said, examining Traveler's teeth. Probably worth quite a bit of money in his prime. Someone invested a lot in his training too. See how he stands for examination? That's years of handling there. But no identification? Miguel asked, watching from the stall door. Dr. Rivera shook his head. No visible brands or tattoos, which is unusual for a horse of this quality. He might have been microchipped, but I don't have a scanner for that. You'd need to take him to an equine specialist to check. What kind of person lets a horse like this end up wandering the roads in a storm? Lucia asked, anger coloring her voice as she stroked Traveler's neck soothingly. The doctor sighed. It happens more than you'd think. Horses live a long time. 30 years sometimes. People buy them as an investment or a status symbol, then realize they're expensive to maintain when they're no longer useful for breeding or showing. He patted Traveler's flank gently. The lucky ones find people like you. After he left, the Martinez family gathered in the barn to discuss their situation. The reality was, stark, they barely had enough resources to maintain their small farm and the few animals they already owned. Taking on a horse, especially one with special needs due to his age and condition, was beyond their means. I found out how much horse feed costs, Miguel said heavily, showing them the notes he'd made at the feed store that morning. And that's just the basics. There's also veterinary care, special supplements for older horses. Elena placed a comforting hand on his arm. We'll put up more signs. Someone must be looking for him. Miguel nodded, but his eyes were sad as he watched Lucia with the horse. His daughter had always been responsible, but he'd never seen her so devoted to a task as she was to caring for this animal. She'd spent the entire day in the barn, only coming inside briefly for meals, and even then, her conversation had centered entirely around their horse. What if no one claims him? Lucia asked, voicing the question that hung in the air between them. Then we'll find him a good home, Miguel promised. Somewhere he'll be properly cared for. Lucia's expression hardened with determination. I'll get a job. I can work at the diner on weekends, or babysit for the Crowleys. I'll pay for his feed myself. Elena exchanged a look with Miguel, a silent communication born of years together. They both knew their daughter well enough to recognize the resolve in her voice. This wasn't a passing fancy. This was Lucia's heart speaking. Let's wait and see if someone claims him, Elena suggested gently. We don't have to decide everything tonight. But as days turned into a week, and then two, no one came forward to claim the horse despite the signs they'd posted and the notice Miguel had placed in the local paper. Dr. Rivera had checked with the other veterinarians in the area. None recognized the horse or knew of anyone missing an Arabian stallion. During this time, Traveler's transformation was remarkable. Regular meals, even the modest ones the Martinez family could afford, had begun to fill out his frame. Lucia's constant grooming had restored some shine to his coat, and the once dull eyes now watched the world with renewed interest. He still showed caution around sudden movements or loud dow noises, suggesting past mistreatment, but with Lucia, he displayed complete trust. She had taken to reading her schoolbooks aloud to him while sitting on an upturned bucket in his stall. Convinced that he enjoyed the sound of her voice, even if he couldn't understand the words. Sometimes, Miguel would pass by the barn on his way to the shed where he worked on his inventions, and hear her laughing, telling the horse about her day as if conversing with an old friend. It was Elena who finally broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "It's been almost a month," she said one evening as they sat around the dinner table. "If someone was going to claim him, they would have by now." Miguel nodded slowly. "I spoke with Joe at the feed store. He said his cousin has a small ranch about an hour north of here. They take in older horses sometimes, give them a place to live out their days. He thinks they might have room for one more." Lucia's fork clattered onto her plate. "You want to give him away? After everything?" "Lucia," Elena began gently, "we have to be practical. Winter is coming, and horses need special care in cold weather. The barn isn't properly insulated, and we can barely afford feed as it is." "I told you I'd get a job," Lucia protested, tears welling in her eyes. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Patel at the convenience store. She said I could work after school and on weekends." Miguel sighed heavily. "And when would you study? Your grades are already slipping because you spend every free moment in the barn." He reached across the table, taking his daughter's hand. "I know how much you've come to love him, mija. But sometimes, loving something means doing what's best for it, even when it hurts." Lucia pulled her hand away, pushing back from the table. "What's best for him is to stay with people who care about him. He trusts us now. If we send him away, he'll think we abandoned him, just like whoever had him before." Her voice broke. "Please, Papa. Please don't make me lose him." Before either parent could respond, she fled from the table, the screen door slamming behind her as she ran toward the barn, her sanctuary, and the place where the one being who wouldn't argue with her waited patiently. Traveler nickered softly when she entered, extending his head over the stall door in greeting. Lucia wrapped her arms around his head. "NEC," burying her face in his mane as tears flowed freely. "They want to send you away," she whispered brokenly. "But I won't let them. I promise." The horse stood quietly, seeming to understand her distress. He remained still, allowing her to cling to him, offering the silent comfort that only animals can provide, uncomplicated by words or explanations, simply present in the moment of grief. Later that night, after Lucia had cried herself to sleep in the hayloft despite her mother's gentle coaxing to come inside, Miguel sat at the kitchen table, papers spread before him. Elena placed a cup of coffee by his elbow. Sitting across from him with her own steaming mug, "We could make it work," he said finally, looking up to meet his wife's eyes. "If I pick up extra shifts at the factory, and with Lucia's part-time job." Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Are you sure? You already work so hard." Miguel's gaze drifted toward the window, through which the dark shape of the barn was just visible in the moonlight. "Do you remember when my father lost his job, and we had to sell my dog?" "I was about Lucia's age." Elena nodded. She'd heard the story many times during their 20 years together. "I never told you this, but I ran away that night," Miguel continued, a faraway look in his eyes. "Packed a bag and got 3 miles down the road before a neighbor found me and brought me back. I never forgave my father for that, not really. Even though I understood later why it had to happen." He returned his attention to the budget before him. "I don't want that for Lucia. Some wounds never heal completely." Elena studied her husband's face, lined with years of hard work and worry, but still capable of such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Then we find a way," she said simply. And so, against all practical considerations, the Martinez family officially adopted Traveler. Miguel reinforced the barn walls with insulation scavenged from construction site dumpsters. Lucia began working at the convenience store after school. 3 days a week, dedicating her earnings entirely to horse feed and care. Elena took on mending for neighbors to contribute extra dollars to what they jokingly began to call the horse fund. It wasn't easy. There were weeks when they ate beans and rice for every meal, so the traveler could have the senior feed doctor Rivera recommended. Miguel's hands grew even more calloused from the extra hours at the factory, the constant repairs to their aging farm buildings. Lucia learned to do her homework by flashlight in the barn during the evenings so she could keep Traveler company while still maintaining her grades. But there were rewards, too. Moments that made the sacrifice worthwhile. The first time Traveler galloped across their small pasture, head high and tail flagged, displaying the grace and power that had once made him valuable, Lucia had clapped her hands in delight, tears of joy streaming down her face. The evening Miguel came home exhausted from a double shift to find his daughter asleep against Traveler's flank in the stall, the horse standing perfectly still, as if aware of his precious sigh. Burden? A peaceful expression on both their faces. The morning Elena looked out the kitchen window to see Traveler carefully following Lucia around the yard as she collected eggs, never more than a few steps behind her, like a devoted shadow. Slowly, Traveler's past began to reveal itself through his behaviors. He stood perfectly still whenever Lucia brought out the old bridle they'd purchased at a yard sale. Clearly trained to be tacked up with military precision, he responded to subtle cues that none of them had taught him, suggesting years of professional training. When Miguel played classical music on the old radio while working in the shed near the barn, Traveler would prick his ears and move in precise, dance-like steps that Dr. Rivera later identified as dressage movements. Someone spent a fortune training this horse, the doctor remarked during one of his visits to check on Traveler's progress. What you're seeing are remnants of high-level dressage training. In his prime, he was probably a show horse worth tens of thousands. Then why was he abandoned? Lucia asked, stroking Traveler's neck as the doctor examined him. Dr. Rivera shrugged. Age maybe, injury, or just someone who saw animals as investments rather than living beings. When the return diminished, they cut their losses. The thought made Lucia hold Traveler a little tighter, whispering promises that he would never be abandoned again. As winter gave way to spring, and spring warmed into summer, Traveler continued to thrive under the Martinez family's care. Though they could never afford the premium feeds or supplements that had once been his daily diet, their genuine affection and consistent attention seemed to nourish him in ways that went beyond physical sustenance. Lucia had taken to braiding wildflowers into his mane on summer evenings, a practice Traveler endured with dignified patience. Though he was too old and they were too inexperienced for any serious riding, she occasionally sat bareback on him for short walks around the pasture, her hands gentle on his mane, her weight carefully balanced to avoid stressing his aging back. It was during one such evening, as the sun cast long shadows across their small property, that fate brought Harrison Montgomery back into Traveler's life. The sleek black Bentley seemed almost comically out of place on the dusty rural road that ran past the Martinez farm. Harrison had been returning from inspecting a potential site for a new development, hundreds of acres of farmland he planned to transform into an exclusive gated community with a golf course as its centerpiece. His driver had taken a wrong turn somewhere after leaving the main highway, and Harrison was irritably consulting his phone's GPS when something caught his eye through the car window, a familiar chestnut form silhouetted against the setting sun. "Stop the car," he ordered sharply, causing his driver to brake suddenly. "Sir?" the driver questioned, looking around for whatever had prompted the command. But Harrison was already lowering his window, staring in disbelief at the scene across the modest farm's fence line. There, in a small pasture beside a weathered barn, stood a horse he would have recognized anywhere. Traveler, the animal he had abandoned at the auction house nearly a year ago. Even at this distance, Harrison could see the transformation. The horse stood tall and proud, his coat gleaming in the evening light, his frame filled out to a healthy weight. But what truly shocked Harrison was the sight of a young girl sitting on Traveler's back, laughing as she wove what appeared to be flowers into the horse's mane. "Wait here," Harrison instructed his driver, already opening the car door. Dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than the Martinez family earned in several months, he approached the fence line, his expensive shoes gathering dust with each step. Lucia noticed the stranger first, her hands pausing in their work as she watched the well-dressed man approach. Traveler's reaction was immediate and unexpected. His ears flattened against his head, and he took several steps backward, turning slightly as if to shield Lucia from the newcomer. "Steady, boy," Lucia murmured, sliding carefully from his back to stand beside him, one hand resting reassuringly on his neck. "What's wrong?" Harrison reached the fence, his expression unreadable as he studied the horse and girl. "That's my horse," he said without preamble. Lucia's eyes widened. "Your horse? You're the one who owned Valor?" Harrison's brow furrowed. "Valor? His name is Traveler. And yes, he belongs to me. Arabian stallion, 18 years old, trained in dressage and jumping." A chill ran through Lucia, despite the warm evening. This was what they had feared for months, someone coming to claim the horse they had come to love. But something about the man's cold demeanor and Traveler's obvious distress made her hesitate. "We found him during a storm last fall," she said carefully. "He was wandering on the road, half-starved. We put up notices everywhere, but no one claimed him." She stroked Traveler's neck, feeling the tension in his muscles. "We call him Valor because he's brave and special. He's part of our family now." Harrison's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Family? He's a horse, young lady. A rather expensive piece of property that appears to have found its way onto yours." He glanced dismissively around the modest farm. "I'm prepared to be reasonable about this. I'll give you $500 as a finder's fee, which is quite generous considering the circumstances." Lucia's throat tightened. $500 was more money than she had ever seen at once. Certainly more than she had earned in all her months of working at the convenience store. It would pay for repairs to the leaking roof, or new shoes for school, or any of the dozen necessities her parents quietly worried about when they thought she couldn't hear. But Traveler, no. Valor was pressing against her now, his large body trembling slightly. This wasn't just fear of a stranger. This was recognition and rejection. Whatever this man had done to him in the past, it hadn't been kind. "He's not for sale," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And I don't think he wants to go with you." Harrison's expression hardened. "What he wants is irrelevant. He's a valuable animal, and I have documentation proving ownership." This was a bluefie had long ago filed the paperwork regarding Traveler as a loss for tax purposes, but he was accustomed to intimidating people with his confidence and authority. "What's going on here?" Miguel's voice called from behind them. He had been working in his shed and had noticed the luxury car parked on the road. Now he approached quickly, wiping his hands on a rag as he assessed the situation with a father's protective instinct. "Papa, this man says Valor belongs to him," Lucia explained, not moving from the horse's side. Miguel took in the stranger's expensive suit and imperious bearing, then looked at his daughter and the clearly distressed horse. "I see," he said simply, though his expression suggested he saw far more than just the surface situation. "Perhaps we should discuss this civilized, sir. Would you like to come inside?" Harrison glanced at his watch, impatient. "I don't have time for prolonged discussions. The horse is legally mine. I'm offering your daughter a reward for finding him, which is more than most would do. $500, cash, and I'll have him transported from your crass property by tomorrow." Miguel remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, sir, if you are indeed the previous owner, there are questions that need answering. This horse was found in deplorable condition, abandoned during a storm. We've invested nearly a year of care and considerable expense in nursing him back to health." "Abandoned?" Harrison scoffed. "Hardly. He was being temporarily housed at an auction facility while awaiting private sale. Obviously, their security was inadequate." "For months?" Lucia interjected, unable to contain herself. "He was skin and bones when we found him. How could you leave him like that?" Harrison's eyes narrowed at being questioned by a teenager. "Young lady, the economics of maintaining aging livestock is not something I would expect you to understand. Decisions had to be made based on return on investment." "Return on investment?" "Ray, return on investment. Lucia repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. He's not a stock portfolio. He's a living creature who was suffering. Lucia, Miguel said quietly, placing a warning hand on her shoulder. He turned back to Harrison. Sir, perhaps we could see some identification and proof of ownership? If everything is in order, we can discuss fair compensation for the care we've provided. It was a reasonable request, and they all knew it. Harrison could feel the situation slipping from his control, something he was unaccustomed to experiencing. He had no documentation with him, and while he could certainly produce records of Traveler's original purchase, explaining the gap between the auction house and now would be more complicated. Moreover, Harrison was suddenly acutely aware of how this would appear to others. A wealthy businessman demanding the return of a horse he had effectively abandoned, now being cared for by a family of obviously limited means. The potential for negative publicity, especially with his new development project in the area needing community goodwill, was significant. As these calculations ran through Harrison's mind, Traveler made his own statement. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Lucia and Harrison, his head raised to its full height. There was no aggression in the gesture, merely a quiet dignity and unmistakable choice. Harrison found himself meeting the horse's gaze, those same large eyes that had watched him impassively for years from the stall at Montgomery Estate. There was something different in them now, not just health, but a spark of something that Harrison, who had spent his life viewing animals as assets rather than beings, couldn't quite name. The horse seems to have made his preference clear, Miguel observed quietly. Harrison's phone buzzed in his pocket, likely his assistant with details about the evening's business dinner. The reminder of his actual priorities made the absurdity of the situation suddenly apparent. He was standing in the dust of a small farm, arguing over an aged horse that had already served its purpose in his life, an animal he had written off financially nearly a year ago. Keep him, Harrison said abruptly, turning away from the fence. He's too old to be worth the trouble of transporting back to my estate anyway. Relief flooded Lucia's face, but Miguel's expression remained measured. And the documentation? We would prefer to have this settled legally to avoid any future issues. Harrison waved a dismissive hand as he began walking back toward his waiting car. I'll have my assistant send whatever paperwork is necessary to transfer ownership. Consider it a tax write-off. He paused, turning back with a businessman's instinct. The property adjoining yours to the east, who owns it? The sudden change of subject caught Miguel off guard. The Wilsons, I believe. Their farm has been in the family for generations. Harrison nodded, filing away the information. My office will be in touch about the horse documentation. Without another word, he continued to his car, his mind already shifting to the development project and how the Wilson property might fit into his plans. As the luxury car pulled away in a cloud of dust, Lucia threw her arms around Valor's neck. He's really ours now, she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. Forever. Miguel watched the disappearing car with a thoughtful expression. Let's wait until we have the paperwork in hand before celebrating too much, mija. But his caution proved unnecessary. 3 days later, a courier delivered a manila envelope containing a bill of sale transferring ownership of one Arabian stallion known as Traveler to the Martinez family for the sum of $1, along with all BM. Relevant registration paperwork. The documents had been signed by Harrison Montgomery himself, with a brief note attached. Consider our business concluded. Do not contact me regarding this matter again. Miguel studied the paperwork carefully, looking for hidden clauses or tricks, but found none. It seems Mr. Montgomery has indeed given us Valor, he told Elena and Lucia as they gathered around the kitchen table. Legally and completely. Lucia whooped with joy, rushing out to the barn to share the news with Valor himself. Elena watched her go with a smile, before turning to her husband. What do you make of it? Men like that don't usually give away valuable things without a reason. Miguel shrugged. Perhaps he recognized the bond between Lucia and the horse. Or perhaps he simply decided it wasn't worth his time to fight over an aging animal. Or perhaps, Elena suggested softly, even the hardest heart can sometimes recognize when an animal has found its true home. Whatever Harrison's reasons, the fact remained that Valor was now officially part of the Martinez family. The paperwork revealed more about his background than they had known before: his prestigious bloodlines, his show records from younger days, the considerable sum Harrison had originally paid for him. It confirmed what Dr. Rivera had suspected. In his prime, Valor had been a champion, a valuable asset to the Montgomery stables. But to Lucia, these details mattered little. What mattered was the horse himself, the gentle soul who had wandered into their lives during a storm and become an anchor for her dreams. In the years that followed, she would learn everything she could about horse care, saving for proper tack, studying training techniques, and eventually applying for scholarships to veterinary programs with essays about the rescue that had shaped her future. For Valor, the modest farm became the home he had never truly had at Montgomery Estate. There, he had been a possession, an investment, another piece in Harrison's collection of expensive things. Here, he was family cherished, not for his monetary value or status, but simply for himself. 3 years after Valor came to live with them, the Martinez family held a small celebration for what they estimated to be his 21st birthday. Lucia, now preparing for college, had decorated his stall with streamers and carved a carrot cake especially for him, complete with apple candles that he devoured with enthusiasm. It was during this celebration that Miguel spotted a familiar black Bentley slowing as it passed their farm. The car didn't stop, but Miguel caught a glimpse of Harrison Montgomery's face through the window, his expression unreadable as he observed the festivities. The development project Harrison had planned for the area had faced unexpected opposition from local farmers and environmental groups, ultimately forcing him to scale back his ambitions significantly. The setback had been covered in the local papers, which Miguel read faithfully each morning. Was that him? Elena asked quietly, following her husband's gaze as the luxury car disappeared down the road. Miguel nodded. I wonder what he thinks, seeing Valor now. They both turned to watch as Lucia led the horse around the yard, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his gait still proud despite his advancing years. Ribbons and wildflowers were braided into his mane, giving him a festive air that somehow didn't diminish his dignity. He moved with the confidence of an animal who knew he was loved, who understood his place in the world. I imagine, Elena said softly, he might be learning something important, even if he doesn't realize it yet. Whether Harrison learned anything from that brief glimpse into a world so different from his own remained unknown. He never returned to the Martinez farm, though his company continued to send the occasional formal letter regarding property values in the area, all of which Miguel politely declined to respond to. For Valor, life continued in its new rhythm of comfort and belonging. He grew older with grace in the care of the Martinez family, his needs always met even when finances were tight. When arthritis began to stiffen his once fluid movements, Lucia researched treatments and adjusted his care accordingly. When his teeth began to wear, they switched to softer feeds that were easier for him to manage. The seasons turned, and life changed as it always does. Lucia left for college but returned every weekend and holiday to be with Valor, maintaining that special bond despite the distance. Miguel's persistent inventing finally paid off with a modest patent that eased their financial struggles somewhat. Elena started a small bakery business from their kitchen that gradually gained popularity in the surrounding communities. Through it all, Valor remained the heart of their family, a living reminder of how an act of compassion had enriched all their lives in ways none could have predicted on that stormy night when a half-starved horse had wandered into their care. One crisp autumn day, 7 years after Valor had joined their family, Lucia was brushing him in the pasture when a sleek car pulled up to their date. For a moment, her heart clenched with the old fear that someone had come to take him away. But the man who stepped out was not Harrison Montgomery. Lucia Martinez? The stranger called, approaching the fence with a friendly wave. Yes, she replied cautiously, one hand resting protectively on Valor's neck. My name is David Chen. I'm a journalist with the Chronicle. He gestured toward Valor. Is that the horse you rescued during the big storm several years back? The one that used to belong to Harrison Montgomery? Lucia nodded slowly. How did you know about that? David smiled. It's actually become something of a local legend. I'm doing a feature on community stories that exemplify resilience and connection, And yours kept coming up in my interviews." He pulled out a notebook. "Would you be willing to share your experience? How finding this horse changed your path?" Lucia glanced at Valor, who was regarding the newcomer with calm interest, showing none of the distress he had displayed with Harrison. "I'd be happy to," she said. "But it's really Valor's story more than mine. He's the one who showed true resilience." As she recounted their journey together the stormy night, the struggles to keep him, the unexpected visit from his former owner, and the years of joy that followed, David took notes, occasionally asking questions that revealed he had already done considerable research into Harrison Montgomery's reputation as a businessman who valued profit above all else. "And how did caring for Valor influence your decision to pursue veterinary medicine?" he asked, nodding toward the textbooks visible in her open backpack nearby. Lucia smiled, stroking Valor's graying muzzle. "He showed me that sometimes the things others consider worthless are actually priceless. I want to help animals that might otherwise be overlooked or discarded because of age or illness. Every living being deserves care and dignity, especially in their later years." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's a powerful perspective. One final question. If I may, if Harrison Montgomery were to read this article, what would you want him to know?" Lucia considered this for a long moment, her hand resting gently on Valor's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath her fingers. "I'd want him to know that Valor found his purpose here with us. That sometimes the value of a life can't be measured in dollars or usefulness. And that letting him go was perhaps the most generous thing Mr. Montgomery ever did, even if he didn't realize it at the time." The article was published the following Sunday, complete with photographs of Valor in his flower-adorned mane, standing proudly beside Lucia in the autumn sunlight. The story spread quickly through the community and beyond, touching hearts with its tale of an abandoned horse and the family who had given him a second chance at happiness. A week after publication, a package arrived at the Martinez farm. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a brief note on Montgomery Enterprises' letterhead. "For Valor's care and your education. Not charity, consider it long overdue compensation for services rendered in rehabilitating a valuable animal. No further communication necessary. H.M." Miguel and Elena were stunned by the gesture, but Lucia understood its deeper meaning. Harrison Montgomery would never admit he had been wrong or that his values needed reassessment. But in his own way, quote, through the language he best understood money, he was acknowledging something important. Perhaps it was recognition of Valor's worth beyond his usefulness. Or perhaps it was simply embarrassment at having his callousness exposed in the newspaper. Whatever his motivation, the result was the same. "What will you do with it?" Miguel asked Lucia as they sat at the kitchen table, staring at the check. Lucia didn't hesitate. "Half for Valor's care fund to ensure he has everything he needs for the rest of his life. The other half for a scholarship fund for veterinary students specializing in care for aging and rescued horses." She smiled, looking out the window to where Valor grazed peacefully in the autumn sunlight. "That way, his story continues to help others, even long after we're gone." And so it came to be. The Valor Legacy Fund was established, providing support for abandoned senior horses and education for those dedicated to their care. Over the years, dozens of animals found second chances because of it, and numerous students received assistance in pursuing their dreams of healing and advocating for the most vulnerable. As for Valor himself, he lived to the remarkable age of 32. Far beyond what anyone might have expected given his earlier hardships. His final years were gentle ones, filled with quiet mornings in the pasture, children who came to hear his story and offer him carrots, and always Kerpere. Always. The devoted attention of Lucia, who structured her veterinary practice to ensure she could return home each evening to the horse who had changed her life. When he finally passed, it was peacefully. On a warm spring morning, with his head resting in Lucia's lap, as she sat beside him in the pasture where he had spent his happiest years. She whispered stories of their time together as he took his final breaths, reminding him of the day they'd found each other in the storm, of the birthday parties with carrot cakes, of the countless quiet evenings when they had simply enjoyed each other's company under star-filled skies. News of his passing reached Harrison Montgomery through a small notice in the newspaper. By then, He was in his 70s, still wealthy, but increasingly isolated as he aged. His empire had grown, but his personal connections had withered. He had outlived 2 wives, was estranged from his children, and found himself surrounded by people who served him out of obligation rather than affection. He kept the newspaper clipping in his desk drawer, though he never spoke of it to anyone. Sometimes, in rare moments of reflection, he would take it out and stare at the photograph of the horse with the girl, wondering about paths not taken and values he had never questioned until it was too late to change. On the Martinez farm, life continued its natural cycle. Lucia's veterinary practice flourished, focusing particularly on geriatric equine care. The small stable that had once housed only Valor gradually expanded to accommodate other rescued senior horses, creating a sanctuary where animals that might otherwise have been discarded were given respect and dignity in their final years. A simple graded marker stood in the pasture where Valor had spent his happiest days. Engraved upon it were words that captured not just his story, but a philosophy that had come to guide the Martinez family and all who were touched by their work. For Valor, once forgotten, forever remembered, who taught us that true worth lies not in usefulness, but in the capacity to give and receive love. Each year, on the anniversary of the stormy night when they had found him, the family gathered at the marker to share memories and place flowers. As Lucia grew older, married, and had children of her own, she brought them to hear the story of the horse who had shaped her path. Her daughter, Elena's namesake, showed a particular affinity for the rescued horses, suggesting that Valor's legacy would continue into yet another generation. Meanwhile, in his luxurious but empty mansion, Harrison Montgomery collected more possessions, made more money, and felt the hollow echo of success without meaning. Occasionally he would see news of the Valor Legacy Fund or glimpse Lucia Martinez's name in veterinary journals. Each time, he felt an uncomfortable stirring, a question he couldn't quite articulate about the nature of value and the measure of a life well lived. In the end, it was a horse, an aging animal he had once discarded without a second thought, who had found not just a home but a purpose, whose life had created ripples of compassion and change that continued long after Semdi. He was gone, and it was a simple family of modest means who had recognized a worth in that horse that went beyond any price tag, who had given him not just care but belonging, and in doing so had enriched not only his life but countless others. Perhaps, in his rare moments of honesty with himself, Harrison recognized the irony that he, who had spent his life accumulating wealth and status, had inadvertently discarded the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. Not because of travelers' bloodlines or training, but because of the connection he might have formed, the lessons he might have learned, had he seen the horse as more than just an investment with diminishing returns. But such insights came rarely to a man who had built his identity on measures of worth that could be calculated on spreadsheets and balance sheets. For the most part, Harrison continued as he always had, acquiring and discarding, seeking satisfaction in ownership rather than relationship. Yet on his office wall, displayed among the certificates of achievement and photographs with celebrities and politicians, there hung a simple frame containing a page from a newspaper. In it, a chestnut horse with flowers in his mane stood beside a smiling young woman, both of them radiating a contentment that no amount of money could buy. If visitors ever asked about this unusual addition to his collection of accomplishments, Harrison would simply say it was a reminder of an investment that had eventually paid unexpected dividends. He never elaborated further, and few pressed for details. But sometimes, when the office was empty, and the weight of his years pressed heavily upon him, Harrison would look at that photograph and wonder about different kinds of wealth, different ways of measuring success. In those moments, he might almost grasp what the Martinez family had understood from the beginning, that the true value of any life, human or animal, lay not in its usefulness or cost, but in its capacity for connection. It was a lesson learned too late for Harrison, but one that lived on through Valor's legacy, touching lives and opening hearts long after both the discarded horse and the man who had once owned him were gone. And perhaps, in the grand accounting of things, that was the most valuable return on investment of all. As for Valor, who had once been Traveler, he had found something far greater than monetary worth in his second chance at life. He had found purpose, dignity, and love, the things every living being truly needs, and the only treasures that actually matter in the end. In the pasture where he had spent his happiest years, wildflowers still bloom each spring around his memorial stone. Children from Lucia's practice often leave carrots or apples there, having heard the story of the horse who was once considered worthless, but proved to be invaluable. And sometimes, in the quiet of early morning or the gentle hush of twilight, visitors swear they can hear the soft nickering of a chestnut stallion, still watching over the family who had given him not just a home, but a, quote, place to truly belong. The tale of rich man tries to sell his horse, but the horse finds a family who truly cares isn't just about a horse finding a loving home. It's about recognizing that worth isn't always measured in dollars, that connection matters more than possession. And that sometimes the most precious gifts come to us not because we sought them, but because we were willing to open our hearts to something or someone others had deemed disposable. In that way, perhaps Valor's greatest legacy was not the fund established in his name or the horses saved because of his story, but the simple reminder that true value often lies where we least expect to find it, and that no life, however humble or aging or seemingly useless in the world's cold calculation, is ever truly without worth.